For years, Sister Wives fans watched Meri Brown fight for something that seemed increasingly impossible to hold on to. She waited, she hoped, she tried to make things work. And even when the relationship between Meri and Kody Brown appeared to be emotionally over, Meri continued searching for answers about what her future could look like. But now, the biggest question isn't whether Meri can get Kody back. It's whether Meri even wants that life anymore. Because after everything we've watched unfold over the years, Meri appears to be entering a completely different chapter, and this time she seems far more focused on herself. And that is exactly what has caught fans' attention. For a long time, Meri's story was tied directly to the Brown family. Her identity on the show was connected to plural marriage, her complicated relationship with Kody, and the constant question of whether their relationship could somehow be repaired. But that chapter has changed dramatically. Meri is no longer simply waiting for someone else to decide what happens next. She's building a life on her own terms. And for longtime viewers, that transformation may be one of the most interesting parts of her entire Sister Wives journey. The Meri fans used to think about where Meri's story began. She was Kody's first wife, and for years, viewers saw her occupy a complicated position inside the Brown family. As the family expanded, relationships changed. New wives entered the picture, children grew older, the family moved from one state to another, and eventually the dynamic that once held everyone together began to fracture. Meri experienced some of those changes more painfully than anyone expected. Her relationship with Kody became increasingly distant, while viewers continued to see moments where Meri seemed to wonder whether there was still something worth saving. That uncertainty became a major part of her story. Fans watched her search for connection, reassurance, and some indication that Kody still wanted a relationship with her. But eventually, the reality became impossible to ignore. The relationship had changed, and Meri had changed with it. A different kind of freedom. What makes Meri's current chapter interesting is that moving forward doesn't necessarily mean forgetting the past. It can mean finally accepting that the past cannot control your future. And that's where Meri appears to be now. Instead of allowing her relationship history to define her, she has increasingly focused attention on her own work, her own interests, and the life she wants to create. That doesn't mean every part of her journey has been easy. It doesn't mean there aren't painful memories. And it certainly doesn't mean fans should assume they know everything happening privately in her life. But there is a noticeable difference in the way Meri presents herself. She seems more comfortable standing on her own. And that may be the biggest change of all. Because for years, viewers asked one question: would Meri ever truly walk away? Now, the more interesting question might be, what happens when Meri finally stops looking backward? And that is where this new chapter becomes much more fascinating. Because leaving an old relationship behind is one thing. Figuring out who you are afterward is something completely different. Meri has spent years being part of one of reality television's most complicated families. Now she has an opportunity to be known for something beyond Kody Brown, beyond the marriage, beyond the family drama, beyond the heartbreak. And fans are beginning to see why that could become one of the most important transformations in her story. But there's still a major question hanging over everything. What does Meri actually want from this next chapter? Is she simply enjoying her independence? Is she rebuilding her personal life? Is she looking toward a future that has nothing to do with the Brown family? Or could there be another major change coming that fans haven't seen yet? That's the part that makes Meri's story so compelling. Because after years of being defined by what she couldn't have, Meri now appears to be discovering what she can build for herself. And that journey is only beginning. For years, there was one question hanging over Meri Brown and Kody Brown: was there still a chance? Even when their relationship looked distant, Meri didn't immediately close the door. That is what made their story so complicated. There were moments when Meri seemed willing to keep trying, while Kody's position appeared increasingly uncertain. The emotional distance between them became impossible for viewers to overlook, but the final answer didn't arrive all at once. Instead, it happened gradually. One conversation, one realization, one painful moment after another, and eventually, the possibility of rebuilding the relationship seemed to disappear. But here's what makes this turning point so important. Meri didn't simply lose a relationship. She had to let go of an entire version of her future. For years, she had imagined what life inside the Brown family might look like. She had spent decades connected to Kody, and walking away from that history wasn't something that could happen overnight. There were memories. There was family history. There were years invested in a relationship that had once meant everything to her. So when the relationship finally reached its breaking point, the emotional impact was much bigger than simply saying goodbye to a partner. Meri was saying goodbye to an identity she had carried for years. The moment everything changed, one of the most important parts of Meri and Kody's story is that the ending wasn't simply about one argument or one dramatic scene. The relationship had been deteriorating for a long time. Their emotional connection had weakened, their communication had become complicated, and eventually, Meri was forced to confront something that she had spent years trying not to accept. Wanting the relationship to work wasn't enough if the other person wasn't willing to rebuild it with her. That realization can be devastating because hope can keep someone connected to a situation long after the situation itself has changed. And Meri appeared to understand that she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for a version of Kody or a version of their marriage that might never return. That was the real turning point, not the dramatic announcement, not the headlines, not the reaction from fans. The real turning point was the moment Meri began choosing reality over hope. And once she did that, everything started to look different. The end of waiting for longtime viewers, this may be the part of Meri's story that is hardest to understand. Why did she stay so long? Why did she keep hoping? Why didn't she simply walk away earlier? But those questions are easy to ask from the outside. Meri was living the reality. She had years of history with Kody. She had emotional connections to the family, and she had built a significant part of her adult life around that relationship. Walking away meant accepting that the future she once imagined was no longer going to happen. That kind of acceptance takes time. And when it finally arrived, it appeared to give Meri something she had been missing for years: clarity. Suddenly, she didn't have to spend all her energy wondering what Kody wanted. She didn't have to keep analyzing every interaction. She didn't have to wait for another sign. She could finally ask herself a much more important question: what do I want? And that question changed everything. Meri starts looking forward. This is where Meri's story becomes less about Kody and more about Meri herself. Her life didn't suddenly become perfect. Moving on doesn't erase pain. It doesn't erase decades of memories. And it doesn't mean every difficult emotion disappears. But moving forward can mean something much simpler. You stop allowing yesterday to decide what tomorrow will look like. And that appears to be the direction Meri has been moving toward. Her business interests, friendships, personal projects, and independent life have increasingly become part of the story. Instead of asking whether Kody might return to her, fans can now watch Meri create a life that doesn't depend on his decision. That is a powerful shift, because for years, the audience was waiting for Meri to receive an answer from Kody. Now, Meri seems to be giving herself the answer, but what about love? And here's where things get especially interesting. Moving on from Kody doesn't automatically mean Meri has completely closed herself off from love. It simply means her future doesn't have to depend on one specific relationship. Whether Meri eventually chooses another serious relationship, stays single, or simply enjoys her independence is ultimately her decision. And that uncertainty is actually part of what makes this chapter so intriguing. For the first time in a long time, fans don't necessarily know what Meri's next move will be. And maybe that's exactly the point. She doesn't have to follow the storyline everyone expects. She doesn't have to prove anything. She doesn't have to rush into another relationship. She can simply discover what makes her happy. And after everything she experienced with Kody, that freedom may be more valuable than fans realize. The bigger meaning behind Meri's new chapter, Meri's journey, also represents something bigger for the Sister Wives audience. We've watched the Brown family change dramatically. Christine moved forward. Janelle created her own path. Meri eventually confronted the reality of her relationship with Kody, and the family that once presented itself as one united household became something very different. But Meri's transformation has its own unique emotional weight because her story involved years of uncertainty, years of wondering, years of hoping, and finally, years of learning that she could survive without the relationship she once believed would define her life. That's why her new chapter feels so unexpected. Not because Meri suddenly became a completely different person, but because she finally stopped measuring her future by what happened with Kody. And that may be the most important thing she has done. Still, there's one question we haven't answered yet. What exactly is Meri building now that she is no longer waiting for Kody? Because if the old chapter was about trying to save a relationship, then the new chapter could be about discovering just how much life exists beyond it. And that is where Meri's story gets even more interesting. Because the woman fans watch struggle for years may finally be ready to show everyone who she is when she doesn't need anyone else's permission to move forward. For years, Meri Brown's story seemed to revolve around one question: would Kody ever choose her again? But now that question feels almost outdated. Because the more Meri moves forward, the less her life appears to be about waiting for someone else to make a decision. And that may be the biggest surprise of all. Meri is discovering something that many people only learn after a major life change. Sometimes the hardest part isn't leaving the past behind. It's learning how to build a future that doesn't depend on it. Meri finds her own identity. For a long time, Meri was introduced to viewers primarily through her connection to Kody and the Brown family. She was the first wife. She was part of the original family structure. She was connected to decades of shared history, but that identity became increasingly complicated as the family changed. As relationships broke down and the original family dynamic disappeared, Meri had a choice. She could continue defining herself through what she had lost, or she could start discovering who she was outside of it. And increasingly, it looks like Meri chose the second option. Her independent work and personal projects have given her something that her relationship with Kody could no longer provide: a sense of ownership over her own life. This doesn't mean everything about her past suddenly became irrelevant. It simply means the past no longer has to control the future. Her business became part of the story. One of the most important parts of Meri's independent journey has been her work. For fans who have followed her for years, her business interests aren't exactly new, but the meaning behind them can feel different now. When someone spends years in a relationship where their personal identity is deeply connected to the family, creating something independently can become incredibly important. It gives you something that belongs to you: your decisions, your goals, your responsibilities, your achievements. And Meri has continued developing that side of her life. Her work has become more than just something fans see on social media or television. It represents independence, it represents consistency, and perhaps most importantly, it represents the fact that Meri doesn't need her old relationship to remain the center of her story. The power of starting over there is another reason Meri's transformation has connected with so many viewers. Starting over doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like waking up and realizing you're finally at peace with a decision. Sometimes it means spending time with people who make you feel valued. Sometimes it means focusing on work. Sometimes it means traveling. And sometimes it simply means enjoying your own company. Meri's new chapter doesn't have to involve one giant announcement. It can happen through dozens of small decisions. And those small decisions can eventually create an entirely different life. That's what makes this stage so fascinating. Fans aren't necessarily watching Meri become someone new. They're watching her become more independent from the identity she had spent years carrying. What about the Brown family? Another major question is how Meri's changing life affects her connection to the Brown family. Even though relationships have changed, decades of shared history don't simply disappear. There are children, there are memories, there are complicated friendships, there are celebrations and painful moments that will always connect these people in some way. But being connected to someone doesn't necessarily mean remaining trapped in the same dynamic. Meri can have history with the Brown family while still creating a future that belongs to her. And that distinction is important because moving forward isn't always about cutting every person from your past out of your life. Sometimes it's about changing the role that those people have in your future. The question fans keep asking, of course, there is one subject that inevitably comes up whenever Meri's new life is discussed. Will she eventually find love again? That's something nobody outside Meri's private life can answer for certain. And honestly, it may not even be the most important question. Because after spending so much time watching Meri's relationship status become the focus of her storyline, perhaps fans should be asking something else. Is Meri happy? Is she fulfilled? Does she feel free? Does she have people around her who genuinely support her? And does she finally feel like she gets to make decisions for herself? Those questions tell us much more about a person's future than simply asking whether they have a new partner. If love enters Meri's life again, it will be one part of her story, but it doesn't have to become the entire story. A different kind of strength. What makes Meri's journey especially interesting is that her strength hasn't necessarily come from having all the answers. It has come from continuing forward even when she didn't know exactly what was waiting for her. That's something fans can relate to because real life rarely gives people a perfect roadmap. Sometimes you leave one chapter without knowing what the next chapter will look like. You simply know that you can't stay where you are. And that appears to be where Meri's story stands now. She has experienced rejection. She has experienced disappointment. She has experienced the complicated emotions that come with watching a family structure change, but she is still moving. And that movement is the story. The Meri fans didn't expect for years. Some viewers may have seen Meri as the wife who couldn't let go, but that description misses something important. Maybe Meri wasn't simply refusing to move on. Maybe she needed time to process, time to understand what she wanted, time to accept what had changed, and time to realize that her value wasn't determined by whether Kody wanted the relationship to continue. Once that realization happened, the possibilities became much bigger. Because suddenly Meri's future wasn't limited to one question. It became an open-ended story. And that's exactly why fans should pay attention to what comes next. Because the most surprising part of Meri Brown's story may not be the end of her relationship with Kody. It may be everything she does after that relationship stops defining her. And there is still one major piece of this story we need to explore. How will Meri's new independence change the way fans see her? And could this finally be the chapter where she becomes completely comfortable with the life she has chosen? After everything Meri Brown has experienced, perhaps the biggest lesson from her story isn't about Kody. It isn't about the end of a spiritual marriage. It isn't even about the Brown family's dramatic transformation. It's about what happens when someone finally realizes that their future doesn't have to look like the life they once imagined. For years, Meri's story was filled with uncertainty. She waited, she hoped, she questioned, she tried to understand where she stood, and eventually she had to face one of the hardest realities imaginable. Sometimes a relationship can have decades of history and still reach a point where moving forward separately is the healthiest choice. That realization didn't erase Meri's memories. It didn't erase the years she spent with Kody. And it certainly didn't erase the emotions connected to the Brown family, but it gave her something incredibly important, a choice. Meri doesn't need to prove anything anymore. One of the most powerful changes in Meri's story is that she no longer has to prove that she deserves someone's attention. She doesn't have to convince Kody to love her. She doesn't have to convince viewers that her relationship was worth saving. And she doesn't have to convince anyone that leaving was the right decision. Her life can simply move forward. That's a completely different position from where we saw her years ago. And maybe that's why this chapter feels so refreshing. Meri isn't necessarily trying to replace the past. She's building something beyond it. Her future doesn't have to follow a script for years. Reality television created expectations around Meri's life. Fans wanted answers. They wanted reunions. They wanted relationship updates. They wanted to know whether she and Kody would ever reconcile. But Meri's real life doesn't have to follow the storyline viewers expected. She doesn't have to immediately find another partner. She doesn't have to completely disappear from the Brown family's world. She doesn't have to make one dramatic decision that changes everything overnight. She can take her time. She can focus on her work. She can spend time with people who matter to her. She can travel, make memories, pursue new opportunities, and simply enjoy the freedom that comes from controlling her own choices. And honestly, that may be more meaningful than any dramatic relationship announcement. What fans should remember, there is an important distinction between moving on and forgetting. Meri doesn't have to erase Kody from her history to create a future without him. She doesn't have to pretend those years didn't matter. She doesn't have to deny the good memories simply because the relationship eventually changed. Moving forward means accepting the entire story, the good, the painful, the confusing, the beautiful, and the disappointing. All of it can exist at the same time. And once someone accepts that, they can finally stop living inside the question of what if? Instead, they can start asking, what's next? That may be the question Meri is finally answering for herself. The new Meri the woman fans are seeing now isn't necessarily a completely different Meri. She's still the same person who experienced those difficult years. But she may have a different perspective. She has learned that being alone isn't necessarily the same thing as being lonely. She has learned that independence can be empowering, and she has learned that a person's value isn't determined by whether another person chooses them. That's a message that goes far beyond Sister Wives, because many viewers have experienced their own version of starting over, a relationship ending, a family changing, a friendship disappearing, a career taking an unexpected direction. Sometimes life forces people into a chapter they never planned to write. And the only choice is deciding what to do with the blank page afterward. Meri appears to be doing exactly that. And then there's Kody, of course. Kody will always be part of Meri's history. That's unavoidable. They spent decades connected to one another. Their lives were intertwined. Their family history is shared. But being part of someone's history doesn't mean they have to remain the center of someone's future. And that may be the most important change in Meri's story. Kody can remain part of the past without controlling what's next. That distinction is powerful because when you stop waiting for someone else to change, you become free to change your own life. So what's next for Meri? That's the question fans should really be watching. Not, will Meri go back to Kody? But what will Meri do now that she doesn't have to wait for Kody anymore? Will she continue expanding her independent life? Will new opportunities come her way? Will she surprise fans with another major personal change? Or will she simply enjoy the peace and freedom she has worked so hard to find? Nobody can know exactly what the future holds. And that's actually exciting because for once, Meri's next chapter doesn't have to be predictable. The final takeaway, Meri Brown's story started with her being part of one of reality television's most unusual families. For years, viewers watched her navigate relationships, family changes, disappointment, and uncertainty, but perhaps the most unexpected chapter is the one happening now. A chapter where Meri isn't defined by being Kody Brown's first wife. She isn't defined by whether their relationship survived. She isn't defined by the Brown family's past. She's simply Meri, and maybe that's what moving on really means, not pretending the past never happened, not forgetting the people who were once important, not rushing into something new just to prove you've healed. It means finally understanding that your future belongs to you. And if Meri continues down that path, her biggest transformation may not be something dramatic that happens on television. It may be something much quieter. She may simply wake up one day and realize, I don't need to wait anymore. And after everything fans have watched her go through, that might be the most powerful ending to her story so far. But perhaps it isn't really an ending at all. It's the beginning of Meri Brown's life on her own terms. If you enjoyed this update, make sure you subscribe to Drama and Receipts for more Sister Wives news, Brown family updates, reality TV drama, and receipts behind the headlines. And tell us in the comments, do you think Meri has truly moved on, or is there still another chapter waiting to unfold?